They describe it as the safest bill of its kind in the world. But that doesn't mean it's safe, and we should dwell on that.
Welcome back, everyone, to what we're going to call the season finale for now of Assisted. And we thought, who better to bookend this period with than lovely Nikki Da Costa. And we just wanted to speak to you, Nikki, about we've had you're our first ever return guest on the podcast, and hopefully not the last time. But we wanted to speak to you, looking back on what's happened in the Commons. Where are we now, and where are we going as we move toward the Lords?
I'm so grateful to talk to Nikki because you've got huge experience in Number 10 as someone who oversaw legislative affairs, and obviously since leaving Number 10 have done lots of great work in telling us all what's happening with this bill on a voluntary basis, amazingly, just literally just doing this because you felt it was important. And you were so clear-sighted last time about the feelings of this bill. And just to recap, MPs voted a couple of weeks ago for this bill to pass to the next stage, didn't they? I mean, were you surprised that happened?
I think it was always more likely than not that it would pass the Commons because of the size of the majority at second reading. However, when I looked at the numbers at second reading, I thought it was sort of an 85% chance that it would pass. In the run-up to third reading, it did look like there was a pathway to MPs rejecting it. Such was the strength of the concerns. And certainly it's understood that there were more MPs wavering than in the end, and the majority was substantially reduced. The majority was halved, and critically, the bill did not secure a majority of the MPs in the Commons support. That's material, but when we talk about a government having a working majority, we talk about, have you crossed that threshold? I think it's about 318 would deliver a working majority for the government. That's not the case with this bill. So that's quite important, both as a signal of the unease in the bill, that there are problems in it, the reduction in support. And that's really important because the Lords now have to take that and they need to look at the bill and think about, is this the right bill? Is this the right approach to how we make this change to society? And we do have a bicameral legislative system where the Lords has parity with the Commons, and we can get into the procedure of that. And there are ways to deal with disagreements, but the Lords do need to do their job now, having received the bill.
So I think what I'm hearing in many of my circles who don't spend as much time on X as I do following this is a sort of going, oh, well, now the bill becomes law. It passed the Commons. The House of Lords would never override the will of the Commons because, of course, we live in a democracy. So I wonder if you could speak to that. Is this a final vote in Parliament? What are the options going forward?
So in terms of the Lords, we have had a novel interpretation of the Constitution by Esther Ranson, who might be forgiven being a celebrity for not understanding the constitutional conventions as they govern the Lords. But what can't be forgiven is the approach taken by Lord Faulkner, who was Lord Chancellor under the Blair government and who really should know better. So what they are arguing is that it's the Lords' duty now to uphold what the Commons has agreed. That's not the case. And you can go back through, we have a unwritten constitution, but we have a lot of debate and exploration of the conventions that bind. So if we take it from step one, first of all, he's relying on here is called the primacy of the Commons. Now, typically this is underpinned by two maxims. One, that the government of the day should be able to get its business done. And two, that the opposition is entitled to ask the government to think again and to scrutinise. Now, we are in a situation where this is not a government bill. So conventions like the Salisbury-Addison Convention do not apply. This is not a government bill. It wasn't in a manifesto. In fact, there is no mention in the Labour manifesto of assisted dying in general. And we know that the government is neutral on this. So as much as this is the Prime Minister's personal wish, the government's stated position again and again, every day of committee, every day of report, every day of third reading, was that the government is neutral and that the policy intent of the bill is not the government's but the sponsors. Now, this is a really important, because as much as they enjoyed the freedom of this not being a government bill in the Commons, in the Lords it's really material. This is not a government bill. It does not have the same protections, and it is just a private member's bill. It is one member of Parliament's bill which has been approved by the House of Commons. And we'll go into more detail. But what this means is that the Lords is perfectly entitled to make a judgment on second and third reading, to scrutinise the bill, to take their time with the bill. And that is a legitimate function. If the two houses get into a disagreement, ping pong, which is the process by which they agree, allows for negotiation. That is the way disagreements are settled. And if the House doesn't pass the bill, if the Lords don't pass the bill, then the way that the primacy of the Commons is asserted is through the Parliament Acts, which is to say that the Commons can come back and reintroduce the bill and go again. There is no block on the Commons having their way, but it is absolutely within the rights of the Lords to take their time and look at the bill afresh as an independent House.
This is so important though, because I think all of us sort of assumed, when us not you obviously, but us on the outside sort of assumed MPs are just going to vote for this, and actually the Lords, it's almost a formality. It really will pass into law. But what you're saying is this wasn't in a manifesto. It was a commitment to Esther Rantzen, beloved celebrity as she is. It's not something that's being run by the government. And actually, if you think about it, like Leadbeater really wanted to do a bill, private members bill, on puppy smuggling until she was approached by charities and important people. So I don't think Charlie Falconer would be demanding that everyone had to pass Kim Leadbeater's puppy smuggling bill. Maybe it's something he feels very strongly about. But it's a really good point you make. We've all got the impression this is Keir Starmer's bill, I'm afraid, because he has made that public commitment. There's definitely a sense that there was pressure on ambitious young Labour MPs to vote it through. But actually, this is just, it's just a private member's bill after all.
Absolutely. And that's also really important for two fronts. When you mentioned puppy smuggling, actually, that's a good private members bill, because typically private members bills that are just waved through by the Lords are non-contentious. That's what the government, when the government does hand out bills, it does those kind of bills because that's a good place to put it. It's not really the forum for such substantial reforms, particularly when you've skipped, and we keep coming back to it, all the policy making process beforehand. So unlike with the Abortion Act, which was a private members bill, there was, for that bill, we had the Peel Committee headed by the president of the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, and they looked at detail of the provisions and they made changes prior to introduction to take into account the views of the medical bodies. That should have happened here. It's not happened. So the Lords are dealing with a bill for which there is very little underpinning. The other aspect of it, in which I think they suggested, the Lords don't typically look at private members' bills in great detail. Well, that's A, because they're not contentious, B, they're usually very slim. We are now talking, I believe, a 59-clause bill, close to 40 powers, 5 Henry VIII powers. The bill has grown and grown through passage, and the answer to every time there's a problem has been to take another power for ministers to determine what the policy is at a later date. So there's so many gaps in this bill. So it's not like any of the other private members' bills. But also, crucially, here's the thing. Usually the Lords doesn't do a lot on private members' bills because it knows that if it makes a single change, the bill has to come back to the Commons, and it's got to come back before the Commons runs out of the 13 allocated sitting Fridays for the session. We're going deep into standing orders here, okay? But bear with me. There's this clock, and it's the 13 sitting Fridays that the government has to provide for private members' business in the Commons. And when those 13 days are up, there's nothing there to receive the bill if the Lords make changes. So the Lords has to rush. But the last two sitting Fridays for this session, required under standing orders, are the 4th and the 11th of July. And second reading for the bill in the Lords is on the 12th of September. The time has already run out at the stage at which the Lords starts to look at it. The Lords is under no deadline other than the end of the session to hasten their scrutiny. If the government so wishes, it may make time for the return of the bill at the time that the Lords has completed its deliberations. There is no clock here. There is no deadline here. And that's really important for saying, actually, take a step back. You've got the time. You can spend the same amount of time at least that the Commons did. The Lords will spend 2/3 the Commons time, then the 2/3 will be the Lords. That's the proportion.
Wow.
Of time. Yeah, so typically Lords will spend more time, and that's why they're trusted as a scrutinising chamber. It's why the MP said, well, we hope the Lords will sort it out, even though we've not had the guts to do it. All of these things emphasise the importance of the Lords looking at this from the start.
So I think I may just be naive to parliamentary process, and I for one am actually really enjoying you kind of spelling this out. So please don't worry. So Is that, I guess, is it atypical? So I thought that if they ran out of those 13 sitting Fridays, the bill would just fall. So is it atypical that in this situation they essentially just have the rest of the parliamentary session?
So typically in a year-long session, so the standing orders say that in a session, the government is required to make 13 sitting Fridays available. But there is convention, sort of implicit agreement, precedent, that the government would, in a long session, which this one is turning out to be, this session should be ending in July, well, imminently, but a year after the King's speech. It's not, and the speculation is it will go to May. Where we've had long sessions before, typically the government will pro rata make available some additional sitting Fridays. In fairness to backbench business, they'll do the same for backbench debates, those kind of things. So there would be an expectation that the government might make some additional time when the Lords is done. It is not hard and fast, it's definitely at the discretion of the government. But given the Prime Minister's personal views, it would be extraordinary that the government didn't make time. But they can make time at the end of the session. There is no problem here about the Lords taking their time.
So just to kind of bring all that together. So am I correct that there's really kind of two major things that could happen here? Either the Lords, begin their process of scrutiny, and there's quite a lot of detail to work through, which we can go to in a moment, and questions and big issues to work through, and they run out of time. So essentially we get to May, the session ends and there's no time left. Or there is agreement between the two houses. There's some ping pong, but eventually there's an agreement prior to May. But we're kind of looking at May as that most likely time that we would have an answer.
Yes, that's absolutely, and you've nailed it, and thank you for just boiling that down. So there's two scenarios, one in which the Lords does amend the bill. Let's get three. One, the Lords just weighs it through. Maybe there's a majority for no changes to the bill at all, and it just goes straight to the statute books. There is nothing anyone can do in those circumstances. If every amendment is voted down, it will go straight to the statute books. One would expect that even if the Lords are ardent backers of assisted suicide and assisted dying, that they would still make some changes, for example, to the powers, etc., in keeping with their traditional focus on how are you using the powers that are being taken in legislation. If they make changes, then you get scenario two. The bill goes back to the Commons, and the two houses have to come to agreement on those changes. And maybe the Lords will back down, maybe the Commons. If they can't, then the bill falls. If they actually can't. I can't see that happening, because if at that stage, everyone will compromise. Then the third scenario in which the bill, it is still live. They haven't completed. And it's worth knowing that at the moment, the government's announced sitting Fridays in the Lords, roughly 2 a month to Christmas. We assume that they will continue that pace to May. On that pace, it really, if the Lords simply match the Commons time in committee, which was 15 days, and 2 in report and third reading, it's impossible for the Lords just even to do it as well as the Commons did. So the likes of Faulkner, etc., will want the Lords to not take that time. But so there's quite a scenario in which the bill is just waylaid. But we can talk, and it's worth us talking about the Parliament Acts, about how you manage that. That's not something that the Lords should feel particularly worried about, in my view.
It feels terrifying that there might be another rushed process with lots of high pressure compromises at the end to get to grips with the bill, which, as many have pointed out, involves the state or private contractors being able to lawfully kill lots of members of the public. I mean, it's so serious that we have to get this right. So, but you're describing that the Lords should not feel pressured to rush this. At least for now, they should take the time to scrutinise this properly. I mean, is there a scenario where they can actually just vote this out, where they can just say, no, this bill is not safe?
Yes, they absolutely can. There are 2 votes on the bill as a whole. Second reading and third reading, just like in the Commons. And now, the Lords on government bills will typically allow a government bill second reading, and they won't actually divide the House. And that's in keeping with the Salisbury-Addison Convention, to say that If a bill is in the manifesto, or if it's in the spirit of the manifesto, they go a little bit broader. You know, there's some widening of the criteria. Then typically they'll be given second reading just, you know, for government bills. But that's not the case in this particular situation. This is not something that has been put to the country. It's interesting. I'm just going to give you a quote, because when the Salisbury-Addison Convention was coined back in the 90s, Viscount Cranbourne at the time basically explained what it was about. He said, it would be constitutionally wrong to oppose proposals which have been put before the electorate. 50 years later, Baroness J of Paddington confirmed, she said, it would be constitutionally wrong when the country has expressed its view for this House to oppose proposals that have been definitely been put before the electorate. That's not the case in this case. So convention on second and third reading disappears. We have a long history that actually, you know, there have been a couple of bills every year usually where there is a division of second reading. So I don't think the Lords are bound in any way to accept this, and it really depends on what the numbers are. They could, for example, go, actually, we will amend the motion for second reading to say, actually, you know, we need more time, or subject to the government providing this information or something. And that might also be a way of the Lords expressing their discontent at that stage, still going forward to the other stages, but saying, we do think there's a problem here. And then you'd have that substantive vote at third reading.
Wow. There's lots of questions, but why, if Keir Starmer and other former heads of the Crown Prosecution Service, who seem to all be very supportive of lawful assisted dying, rather than the messy work of Crown prosecutors having to deal with difficult situations, it seems. But why wouldn't he just put it in the manifesto as Labour leader? I mean, why make this commitment and have this private members bill approach, do you think?
I remember reading something in the papers that there was discussion of this, and somebody quite wisely killed it off and said that, you know, they didn't want Labour becoming the manifesto for death or something. I can't remember the exact quotes, but they viewed it as not a politically palatable thing. This is a Labour government return to power after 14 years, and they've had a Ming Vase strategy on so many things. Don't possibly tell the electorate what you plan to do with the power. Why would you then stick into that, but we'll pass assisted dying and make sure that those that feel that they're a burden, depressed, suicidal, in financial distress, or can't access services can kill themselves, which is the effect of the votes that the MPs took at the last day of deliberations in the Commons. They explicitly said, be agnostic as to why somebody is doing this.
I find it profoundly disturbing, because I don't think anyone has worked out a way to do assisted dying without introducing, frankly, as we discovered, homicidal men into your system. I mean, it seems that you can't do it without it going off piste, without it expanding, without it going wrong, as it stands. But, I mean, why MPs thought to vote this through, I don't know. We are where we are, I guess. One of the things I've noticed that, you know, I think some of the proponents of the bill will say, well, actually, but the public do support this. You know, okay, it hasn't been, you know, it wasn't in the manifesto, but the public really support it. Like, and we ran polling of our own and on eating disorders and domestic abuse, and actually, it turns out that the public might be supportive of the principle of assisted dying, but they are not supportive of the practice. So the reality that people in domestically abusive relationships might be coerced into assisted death is something that actually a huge majority of the population are really worried about, and the public don't support assisted death where that would lead to people with eating disorders being assisted to kill themselves. I mean, there's almost no public support for a bill of that nature, and that's the bill that we've got. So I think this is something that actually in practice has real public opposition. But is your sense, that people who support the bill will say that this bill has been through huge scrutiny by, sort of 90 hours of scrutiny in committee stage, it's been through many hours of debate, or some hours of debate in the House. Is your sense that this is now a safe bill?
I think it's really good that you identified that question, because the language used is very interesting. They describe it as the safest bill of its kind in the world, but that doesn't mean it's safe. And we should dwell on that. And when the government has repeatedly said, for example, ministers speaking at the dispatch box, and dispatch box comments are, it is of a higher standard than public utterances. The ministers have reassured and said, it is our job to make sure it's workable. The provisions can be operationalized. But that doesn't mean it's safe. I think this is, and there is nothing written down anywhere that says this provisions will mean that nobody will wrongfully die. And therefore MPs and peers, well, peers now, because MPs have already peers have to confront this. If it is the Commons' will that you should be able to choose this, to freely choose this, then the job of the Lords is to say that those choices should not come at the cost of others that would not freely choose this. To make the equation, because we know the NHS is not safe, just in general. No system is safe in general. The NHS specifically is not safe at this period of time. Therefore, the choice will always have on the other end of the scales that some will die through these means who shouldn't. And the job of Parliament was to make that number as small as possible. So the Lords must reassure themselves on that duty. And I was struck by another quote. This came from the 2000, I think it's the Wareham report. This was the Royal Commission into Lords Reform. And they said, there is no check on the right of Parliament to pass legislation. There is no ability to go back. Parliament is sovereign. As such, it is incumbent on Parliament to diligently work through the details of the legislation that's there. And it's particularly the case for the House of Lords. So it was reaffirming the importance of the Lords' roles, given that there was no block, because the Parliament Act is only about delay. There is no block on the Commons doing anything it wishes. Therefore, the role of the Lords is particularly important as a check and balance on the Commons, not just as a scrutinising chamber, but as a check and balance.
Yeah, I want to dig into that piece a little bit more, because we talked a little bit about, it sounds like we've established that there is a real responsibility. It's incumbent on the Lords to make sure that this bill, one, does what it says on the 10, which is a question in and of itself. Is it workable? And then also is safe and doesn't kind of, I always get back to that question Professor Sleeman asked, what margin of error are we okay with? So I wonder, Nikki, there will be many who say this is just a matter of ironing out a few details in the Lords. But I think you've spoken to a couple fundamental issues that I wonder if we could unpick for a moment. One is the question around choice. So proponents would argue, well, and I would say we heard from the sponsor of the bill on the floor of the House, this bill creates choice. No one who doesn't want to can choose it. That via the Mental Capacity Act, it says that a person has to be making a voluntary, settled, informed wish to die. They have to have capacity to do so. Is there work to be done there? Is the mental capacity? Can you speak to kind of whether the Mental Capacity Act is an effective, workable safeguard to carry that out?
And I would emphasise this is not my area of expertise. So I'm going to sort of share what we observed from the debate. The Mental Capacity Act was created to ensure that, particularly those with learning disabilities, that they would be able to have more of a say in the decisions made about their healthcare. It came from that place. And so it's based on, can you understand, retain, weigh, and use information? I may have got the order wrong there. But can you do that? And you have to start from a presumption of capacity. So in all cases, you don't have to assess. In this bill, you don't have to assess capacity. You must presume it. You don't have to prove it. And to go back to the polling, people wanted to have proof that people did have capacity to make the decision. So baked into the bill is the decision to found it on the Mental Capacity Act, and to say that decision to end your life is the same as for any other treatment or health, to treat them as equivalent despite the finality of doing so, and to say that you don't need to distinguish between the vulnerability of the groups that are in this position. The bill says that as long as you are terminally ill and with 6 months, a reasonable probability that you will die in 6 months, then you meet the criteria, and then it doesn't matter, as we heard from the bill sponsor, it doesn't matter why. So there's a question mark there. Do you really have a settled wish to die? If it's because you can't get palliative care? Do you have a settled wish to die if you are alone and can't get somebody in to help you, wash? And it's just so bad. Do you have a settled wish to die if it's because you're in financial distress? So the bill says that actually, yes, it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter what's driving you. That's stitched into bill. Those are fundamentals. Now, there are issues that could be somewhat addressed. For example, getting the doctors to actually ask, why do you want to do this? You could maybe strengthen it somewhat by saying, well, you should have a psychiatrist should assess what's your mental state? Those are kind of things that you could do, but there are some fundamental questions under there. But the Lords are going to have to really get into that, because we saw, that we heard from Chris Whitty saying, oh, there's, the chief medical officer asserting, oh, no, there's a higher standard for decisions of life and death. And he then had to issue a letter of retraction to say, I was wrong. Well, that's your chief medical officer. Yeah. Lots has been said about the ability of doctors to assess capacity. It just goes on and on. There's so much that is unstable and not well-founded.
I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding in the public and even among some parliamentarians that the Mental Capacity Act assesses a person's mental health state. It doesn't ask anything about depression. It doesn't, you can be very depressed and have a wish to die and still be assessed to have capacity to make that decision. So I think that's a really important one, that the Mental Capacity Act isn't necessarily a stand-in for a free choice that's been made without impairment of mental illness.
I think that this is what has really struck me in the bill. The bill appears to come from the motivation of just viewing us as bodies. The physical body is, will, die, but it doesn't think about mental state or what mental state. And that's a complete, as we've heard from the government's own suicide advisor, it's a complete departure from how we've addressed every other mental health issue about if somebody feels suicide, I want to end my life. The state has traditionally taken a different approach, but here we're flipping it and said, okay, let's get you into the system.
I think the thing the bill seeks to do, and I know that the people who design these bills often are very thinking much of their perfect customer, the people like Esther Ransom, who is still with us, she's massively outlived her prognosis, but they're thinking of people like her, and we're removing that social norm that says that you don't suggest to people that they kill themselves. You don't validate their idea that killing themselves is a good idea. That simple rule means that you avoid having to assess the capacity of everyone who tells you that they're feeling down in the dumps or struggling with life. It means you don't have to worry about whether someone's got learning disabilities or doesn't have any friends. Perfectly valid reason for accessing assisted suicide in Oregon for someone with a terminal diagnosis. I mean, you don't have to worry about that because you just don't validate that decision to die. And I just think it's such a serious shift, that change in social norms, that we haven't reckoned with.
And it's interesting, I think it's almost like Parliament's become adverse to considering the profound underpinning of the legislation. That essentially it says that when greeted with somebody in despair, that your step is not to try to tackle the despair, but to endorse the despair, to say. And I recognise this, for those that are terminally ill and dearly want this, these questions being raised are viewed almost as cruel. You're getting in the way of that choice. But we have to think about both cohorts, those that dearly want this option and those for whom this option will be a threat, a path that they will be pushed down. And they are not, and Parliament's job was to look after both cohorts.
Yeah, it brings me to a second, I think, question, and we're, again, this isn't necessarily just cleaning up the details. These are fundamentals. On the face of the bill, it's supposed to be limited to people who are terminally ill. And if you talk to members of the public or you talk to MPs even, and who are in favor of this bill, they talk about, what about a person with ALS? What about a person with motor neuron disease? And they're going, they're losing their ability to move. They're suffering. They're saying that they want this. Well, the irony, or really tragic irony, is that this bill that they've pushed so hard to push through is not necessarily actually going to be accessible to those individuals that they can make the strongest case for. So I wonder if you could speak to that kind of workability, if you will, of the intent of the bill, which is to help individuals in the very final stages of life who are experiencing, we have to presume, even though it's not in the bill, suffering, and that makes them want to end their lives. Will this bill actually help those individuals?
We know that the bill won't hold, one of the cases that has been advanced is to say one person a week goes to Dignitas, and that's and not everyone can go to Dignitas. But what we do know is that Dignitas has very, very wide criteria, and that many people will be excluded from this bill. However, I don't think it's a flaw in the bill, because I believe that this is taken as what is the least we can ask for in legislation to establish the premise. And having done so, having secured the change of law for this cohort, we then have a staging post from which we can expand to future cohorts. Because in the same week that the third reading of the assisted dying bill was, we had a vote on the Tuesday in which I think MPs spent 45 minutes debating the decriminalisation of abortion up to birth for women. And what that means is that a woman on her own may kill the baby the day before birth, even on the day, as long as the child isn't born, with no repercussions. Now, that was a lesser version of another amendment which would have allowed for others to assist in this. But we can see it as, and I give this not to conflate the two issues, but an example of the Abortion Act exists as a separate piece of legislation. This was an amendment to the Crime and Policing Bill. But you got a significant expansion of the provisions through the Crime and Policing Bill. We saw a previous expansion of abortion, this is about telecare for abortion, in the Health and Social Care Bill 2022. So what we will see is with this bill, it creates the foundation, and then through future healthcare bills or future crime and policing bills, you'll be able to expand the cohort and the provisions through just a single little amendment. So this is not where it stops, and this is where the slippery slope starts. And anyone that says this won't happen need only look to the recent legislative examples.
I didn't see the abortion proposals coming. I've heard things like that mooted. I think no one wants to see a situation in which a woman who has terminated her very late pregnancy is in that situation. It just feels like a terrible outcome. But the solution that's put forward is that we should just don't do the policing bit. Whereas I do think we need to look at why are women terminating very late pregnancies. That's appalling. And I think you're exactly right to suggest that the two issues are linked. So the two campaigns, abortion and assisted dying, have been very often the same people campaigning for both. And I think we have to, even if you're very pro-choice, I think you have to recognise that the Abortion Act was a much more thorough legislative process, which doesn't involve, to be clear, killing thousands of adults every year, but it has expanded. So, you can now get a telephone consultation to have abortion pills sent to your home. That's an expansion of the law, and a removal of a safeguard that was in place to have to meet someone in person. And to be honest with you, I think the vote on the expansion of the law, the decriminalisation of late abortions, so that women wouldn't face prosecution, was sprung on everyone, and it was very I don't know if it was strategic to have it just timed before a couple of days before the assisted dying bill, but it very much is a very sort of choice. It's a choice-based feminist, pro autonomy campaign point, which I wonder if that just primed everyone to think. The book ending of the week was the comment, wasn't it? That you had these two pieces of enormously transformative legislation that change everything for everyone. In just 1 week. And I cannot believe that a single MP has managed to get to grips with the real life impacts of both of those in a single week.
It may have been strategic because one of the tactics has been to essentially kind of paint any person that is critical of an assisted dying bill in any way as a anti-choice religious zealot, and so putting those two things side by side in news commentaries was certainly effective, I think, for one side of the campaign. But I think, Nikki, to your point, I think you've shown that a bill as it's passed does not necessarily mean that bill is going to stay that way in the future, which is one of the big concerns. And there's many ways that can happen. It can happen through parliament, like change through parliament, but there can also be kind of court cases that expanded, and it's certainly what we've seen in other jurisdictions.
It could also be through personal discretion. So take the fact that we know that the minister confirmed it's the balance of probabilities for a doctor's decision and for the panel, which they were, when pressed, said, yes, that's 51% sure. If you're 51% sure the person meets the criteria, you must approve them. So take a situation in which somebody thinks, actually, this prognosis, it's pretty borderline or thing, and I'm a little uneasy, but actually I don't have legal grounds, so I'm going to sign them off. And maybe you also get a cohort who self-select, they specialize in this area, and they become over time sort of inured to it. And we saw, for example, I think it's in Oregon, where at the start I think over 20% of people were referred for psychiatric referral when they applied, and it's down to I think 3% of cases. Now, I may have got those figures wrong, forgive me, and put a footnote in. But it was that kind of decline in safeguards that are that are built into the legislation. It says that should happen, then just through common practice, they are no longer accessed. So we do know that there's a number of safeguards in the bill where it says if the doctor should consider whether they should consult. I mean, in legal terms, this is the lightest of possible ways to draft such a clause. You should, I have sat here and I have thought about it, and no, I've decided not to. You have met the duty in the law. So there are those kind of things where just the practice of the legislation will widen access. I was very struck looking at the New Zealand figures that, and I don't mean to suggest that these two are the same, that 11% of those who had assisted deaths in the last year for which there is a report were disabled, and 11% they did not know the diagnosis that led to their accessing. So not to suggest the two, but why did they not know for 11% what it was that for the criteria? How is that even possible given the criteria in the legislation?
If I may, this is something that's coming up in the data in the US at the same time, and I'll look closely at the New Zealand data. In the US, there are multiple states that acknowledge in their annual reports that there are sometimes up to 50 missing forms every year that are supposed to, and we're not talking about like administrative paperwork. We're talking about the patient indicating that they've given informed consent for the procedure, talking about the diagnosis being listed. And that is, you'll see it in the state report, and they'll say, we continue to try to educate our healthcare providers on the requirements in the law and remind them that they don't have the immunities afforded to protection to physicians. It would not surprise me if that's happening in other jurisdictions. And the level of regulation, and I wonder if this will come up in the Lords, the level of regulatory oversight needed to ensure compliance with this kind of law is expensive, it's time consuming, and there's perverse incentives at play. So there is a default to go, we trust doctors, we trust physicians, we can lean into their discretion here. And often you will see in jurisdictions that the reports are doing little more than just giving statistics, but the agencies themselves don't have a regulatory function. They're not tasked with following up and say, where's that proof of that the person consented to it, for instance.
And we heard this in Canada too. There's been 400 breaches in one of the states in Canada. None of them have been referred to the police. We heard that in Australia when we spoke to the experts out there. The point of these systems is that there is no off switch, because frankly, I don't think you can have an off switch. So if you had a single failure point, the whole thing gets switched off. It will get switched off really quickly. I think that's the fundamental issue. I don't think they can be made safe. Maybe they could be made safe in a future world where you had the most hardened cynics operating the system. But my fear is, as we've seen, you attract fanatics, you attract people who will push the rules further. And to that earlier point, we spoke to Liz Carr, and she said that all of the people who featured in these big campaigns about assisted dying, they've been able-bodied people who've acquired a disability, so things like motor neuron disease or multiple sclerosis even, which shouldn't be covered by this bill, but have been the poster children for rights and choice. And that's the crux of the campaign, as most people understand it, is actually these degenerative disabilities those are the people who should be able to access this. And that's a wild expansion on what's being proposed at the moment. Are we depressing ourselves?
We don't have to do it to ourselves.
Once again, I'm struck that here are three women who have other things to be getting on with, and we're burying ourselves in the details of the provisions and the statistics from all other jurisdictions trying to wake people up. And, let us hope, the Lords is known for its diligence. And this is the time when they can step up. There won't be the control that Kim was able to exercise in the Commons. Committee stage involves every peer. Every peer has a right to speak. Every peer has a right to table amendments, and those amendments can be debated and report. Every amendment can go to a vote. So this is where these issues need to be addressed. I'm hopeful that the Lords will step up to this, because it certainly didn't happen in the Commons.